There is just one more department and separate to cover in the lower layer. And this one is much less sympathetic. In more than one way. The extraction department decreases the manufacturing cost of egos by between 4 and 12%, depending on the amount of clerks still alive, and increases ego defense rates and attack rate by between 3 and 10%, depending on how long an agent works in that department. This department takes care of all physical materials in order to maintain the company, and plays a big role in restoring collapsed facilities and extracting ego arrangements, and restoration of abnormalities. These are the jobs of the extraction team. That's why its employees are always facing something from the deep hole, and have an empty hole in their hearts as well. Hard to know who's on detail then, considering what we've found so far. Research projects are ego restoration, lowers the chance of losing the ego upon death, re-extraction, which allows a re-extraction of an abnormality or a re-roll when an abnormality is chosen, and gift division, which doubles the percentage that determines the possibility for employees to acquire an ego gift. For example, if the chance of getting a gift was 1%, it would be 2%. Well, not exactly good odds, but it's better than it was before, eh? And you're probably wondering who's in charge of this one. Well, it's one that wasn't originally meant to be in the facility in the first place. Bainar. On the Kabbalist Tree of Life, this means understanding. It gives shape to the Spirit of God associated in the soul with the power of conceptual analysis and reasoning, both inductive and deductive. It also implies the ability to examine the degree of truth or falsehood inherent in a particular idea. Guardian, the arbiter of the head, the precision instrument, the subtle enforcer, the one that's called to deal with a problem when discretion is required. During one such assignment, she spoke of the ruins becoming barren after torturing an employee from H Corporation, after they did what she told them to do. She ignored them and went on to ask if they felt anything about that place that they belonged to that was now all ashes and rust, implying that this employee was part of a corporation that was likely destroyed, although the method was unknown. But it likely involved fire, due to needing heat to make ashes. Certainly of those that works there. As for the rust, how to make rust that quickly? Unless it was falling apart before she arrived. She couldn't feel anything looking at a meteor shower or shiny sunlight since her childhood. But inflicting pain on others made her feel something. But it's not enough. She still wants more. She asks, why was he trembling, and where were his guts? She couldn't believe that he tried to betray his comrades. He fearfully asked to be let go, as she has everything that she wanted from him. She didn't think of it as a perfect plan, but an okay one, where thanks to those that trusted him, they have a nice view. Well, that's one way of putting it. She sees trust as a nice weapon for killing people with. She then decided to wait for scavengers to arrive, as she couldn't be bothered to kill him herself. They're never late. They have a symbiotic relationship. She leaves the dregs to them. She sees the desperate panic on his face, as that makes him look alive as he's torn apart painfully by the scavengers as she finishes her tea. The metallic scent and silence are her best friends. The dead like them too, as far as she's concerned. She then moved on to the next place, following information given by some orange-haired child. But the weak ones give valuable information. She wants to know what face that they'll show that they're alive next. Yeah, this sums her character up nicely, and I use nice loosely here, as she's a sadist and a psychopath. She considers the screams of her victims as music to her ears. She'd like the singing machine. She prefers a long drawn-out process of torture, pain, and death, in that order, as opposed to just getting on with it. Yeah, she's a candidate to getting the Least Redeemable Character Award, certainly for the game Lobotomy Corporation. Then, sometime later, thanks to her spy within the Lobotomy Corporation, Michelle, the head found the location. They were also informed of experiments that had a potential threat to them. So they sent Garion to the Lobotomy Corporation to take care of the problem. She was armed with abilities that would easily allow her to unlock doors, but she was let into the office of Daniel by him, one whom that she could easily coerce into doing what she wanted. After that, the abnormalities were released, but she could easily handle them. Then at least 2 claws arrived to finish what the abnormalities were unable to, just to make sure. Yeah. Clearly the word overreaction isn't in the head's vocabulary. Unfortunately, Guardian and the claws, along with the abnormalities, would not have it all their own way. Because you see, Kali arrived and killed both of the claws and carved through any abnormalities in her way, but not without the loss of one of her arms. Yeah, that's where Kali and Garian's stories intersect. And I believe you know what happens next. Garian saw it as merciful to taunt Kali with her severed arm. She then continued to taunt the Red Mist herself by telling her to come at her. A suicidal statement on her part, which resulted in a fight to the death. And Garian received the mimicry sword through her torso. Although Kali died not long after due to her previous injuries. Honestly, did Garian really believe that it was wise to pick a fight against someone who has fought her way through multiple abnormalities and 2 claws? I mean, she might have had only one arm left and she was quite heavily beaten up, but Garian was still beaten by that one-armed Blood Knight. A spoke of Garian being badly wounded by Kali, yet she was their only way out. It was a miracle that they captured her. They were too far down the road filled with remorse to feel guilty, especially as she was the one that caused so much death in the facility that day. So he decided to dig through her head about how to avoid the head's gaze, a way to get into one of the wings, and the way for them, the few, to survive. Guilty towards a psychopath who used coercion to break their defenses and let the claws in? The blunt objects intended to do to Lobotomy Corporation what likely happened to H Corporation? Had it coming. She certainly wouldn't feel guilty about her actions. In fact, she'd derive sadistic pleasure out of it, in the highest concentrations, outside of a chain and hook session with Pinhead. Yeah, she's that twisted. Well, if she isn't, it's probably not off by much. It was impossible to discover these on their own. She was barely breathing, largely due to the mimicry ego pinning her to the wall. But her brain was still active. That was all they needed. They dug through her head, just like they did with Carmen, although with much less restraint and concern for her welfare. They were searching for a way out of their current situation. Yes, unlike with Carmen, A decided to break her mind, using methods besides a gruesome use of torturous violence. After they were done and extracted what they needed, he collected every deformed part of her. One who is barely human, and made her guard the gates of hell, and must always despair so that she not fall into it, thrown into a hole until even the soul was rotten. Yeah, I think her soul was rotten long before that. I mean, her favourite music is screams of agony? Bina, as she was as a Sephira, was a short-haired woman. At least she appeared that way, with black hair, with a bit of yellow dye on the tip of one side and an earring on the other side. She wore a grey dress with a black cloak, both with a yellow honeycomb pattern. She used to be Guardian, the arbiter of the head, that caused the deaths of many within the facility, including Daniel, Kali, and almost killed A and Benjamin. She looked almost identical to how she did when she was human. And even that description is debatable. She had no anger towards him. The manager had made fun of him by saying, "Oh, Agony, you will never leave me, so I came here to honor you." It's hard to know the flow of time in that place. Apparently, eternity saved her. Yeah, that's debatable, isn't it? Would you consider being thrown in a prison with no way of determining the length of time you've been there as being saved? I mean, if you consider that to be saved, how bad must being out of that prison have to be? She then asked if the manager saw shrouds of a huge river that crossed the entire city, going downstream after the wild rapids and the winding current. There's a broad, but peaceful meadow. That land is covered with all kinds of mud, sand, and sludge that has come from upstream. Those not caught by the upper stream and the midstream would finally end up there at the bottom. To receive all the sludge that piles up, a strong back is recommended, one that won't break easily. Well, considering that her body is made of metal, it would take much more to do that than when she was human. Many worlds are in the extraction department. She has to draw water every day, but the water level never seems to lower. Yeah, I suspect what she calls water is something that's not safe for pretty much anything organic. That isn't an abnormality to consume. The well is so deep that the bottom can't be seen, and has been the source of all humankind and their relics from ancient times. The water inside the well never flowed outside. Only a few ripples have permeated from the leaves that fell from the winds. Their role is to bring the water that's deep inside the well back to the surface. You never know what the bucket might contain from the eternal darkness. But she pulls water from the pulley, no matter what. She warns to be careful not to fall into the well. It's a warning for those who are thirsty, trying to quench their thirst. A put the bucket in the well. He didn't pour the water. Vina is not her name. It's a sad name of the place where many graves are located. She draws the water and asked what he wanted her to draw. Yeah, it's definitely not 2 atoms of hydrogen mixed with oxygen, as that's what water is. And what is not down the well that she speaks of. And she's speaking of different artifacts and possibly abnormalities. In that case, the water she speaks of would likely be safe for them, because that's where some of them come from. Either that or are made from. Yeah. The tombstones of her department are a sight to see. There are many days where she spent reading all the meaningless letters written on them. There are also coffins, death itself, but also the possibility of birth. She's been guarding them for years, performing the dedications for those who can't leave there. One of the few things she does there. The irony that one who tried to destroy the facility is trapped there in service to it. Spend enough time in the grave, the whispers of the dead can be heard. The sound of their words are so dark, it makes her feel like she's filled with black water. She's noticed that he's taking a look around there and starting to get bored. She doesn't always have guests, and she'd feel bad to only show him the tombstones. Yeah. Spend enough time in the grave? More like the graveyard. Yeah, that makes much more sense. Sorry about that. Right. Where were we? Before I started to lose control of myself. I'm surprised that I'm able to maintain control. Oh yes, there is that. An employee arrived. One whose boundary has once crumbled. One in charge of extracting ego. He saw inside the well by chance, but survived. But not without a cost. He was saved by being given the maximum dose of enkephalin. He was able to return to work after that. But once you glimpse through the crack of the boundary, you can never go back to the world where you once belonged. That's one case of an addictive drug actually being helpful. I suspect that Bynar wasn't talking about the withdrawal kicking in for enkephalin when she said that once you glimpse through the crack. Oh dear. Yeah. The blind would probably be safe around there as they can't glimpse through anything. Then again, they probably didn't want to have to take into account that by putting in Braille everywhere. She then asked the employee what he saw and what he had to forget. He recalled that from the tombstone there were sleeping people, deep down, the ones dreaming good dreams. They're also called the well, where they're extracted and cogito injected into them. Then he saw that man. He went inside after that. He passed out, not long after. Who was that man he spoke of? She stated that they can't obey her. He pushed himself to the limit to obey her orders for him to pass out without completing his sentence. She says not to worry, as a mind that weak wouldn't last a day. It's easier to do nothing and just watch the sands fall away, rather than try to stop the sandcastle from collapsing. Yeah, that sounds right about her. Seeing life as worthless, even by that world's standards. Probably why she was made an arbiter. Yeah. I question the wisdom of giving someone the combined authority of judge, jury, and, when necessary, executioner to one so unbalanced on the inside. As a law enforcer should not derive sadistic pleasure out of their job, as there's a risk of them going too far. Then again, as far as the head is concerned when dealing with threats, too far doesn't apply. In either case, she says that she had saw what the employee saw for hundreds, thousands, if not more times, which implies that either her mind is one of the strongest there is, or she was broken long before she was a Sephira. Bainar asks why she's still sane enough to talk with him peacefully. Well, she can barely contain her spirit thanks to her mechanical body, the strong back that never breaks. Although she was still born with a human mind, from a human mind, if you will. Even if she goes crazy and runs amok, destroying everything, including him, Angela would turn the power off. Although she'd rather have the manager kill her than Angela. It's the least that could be done to a confined person like her. Yeah, I can't see that happening because death is a mercy that such a sadist doesn't deserve. It's why she was a Sephira in the first place, and not simply discarded and made to stay dead. Yeah, there are worse things than death. Certainly in her case. Bainar mentions that fierce fights break out there every day. Just as she had lived up until that moment. It had been seen countless times. Abnormalities come back to life, regardless of how many pieces they're broken into. This fact was one of such that drove Gibberah mad. She took too long to realize that abnormalities are to be exploited, not terminated. Or perhaps she couldn't shake the anger of her past off. She sees it as none of her business. But she knows that she'll never see her old self again. Although she's awestruck to Ego's potential whenever Gibberah goes berserk. Yeah, I bet you do. And you're probably asking, why doesn't she use them and go berserk? But in a more controlled and, well, A has never known this. He's never wielded them. Extracting ego is one of her many works. She's naturally drawn to it. The red mist herself was the only one who could draw out its true potential. And those who have fought her during her meltdown will know by how much. If Bainar knew that before she had possibly foolishly tried to take her on, even with one arm, she'd have done anything to get her hands on them. Then the circumstances might have been greatly different. After being contained there, she was ordered to merely extract ego, but forbidden from using it. Probably due to a fear that she'd use it against the facility. I suspect that there's a built-in failsafe that prevents her from doing so. The irony that the department that she's in charge of forbids her from using that which is extracted, even though her bloodthirstiness is locked behind a metal wall. She had nothing left, although the yearning for blood may rise again, as it's merely sealed, not eradicated. Yeah, that's the problem. If she has an opportunity, she'll take it. Bainar mentions A not being able to stay in the light outside, holding on to his suffering, doing one of the few things that she could do on her own volition, torment him emotionally. She chuckled as she said that he gave her pain just as much as she gave him, while also mentioning that the red mist was the only one to get the better of her. A might have told himself that she deserves even more than that. Was he an upholder of justice? If so, why is he looking like a prisoner, like her? He who fearfully avoided her dying gaze. Why is he being punished like her? It's a satisfying view to her. Questioning what Carmen's great idealism came to be. He dragged down his own hero. Did he think that his duty was fulfilled after shedding a tear at the funeral of the innocents, when their bodies were still restless? And the manager, he was caught up in this as well. Long after A was, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Ironically, he found hope in all that misery. The material that the bucket was made from, the gateway to everyone's river, using it to draw water from the well of others. The bucket rises with the water of a person from the well of a person. The ancient river, floating at the bottom, even before the world was born, drawn whether the person gives their consent or not. A change comes when the bucket that holds Carmen's saturated ideal and others' ego. Bainar said that it's perhaps hard to understand just by listening, so she showed him Carmen's miracles with matrix code in the background. She'd do it for him, even though it's burdensome. People selected long ago are waiting. Bainar brings them according to the record. She showed an employee that has abandoned everything that is himself long ago. The remains of the past or pain of the present aren't important to him. He only sees the future. When asked if he's dreamt well, the employee speaks incomprehensibly after she tells him to dream eternally as he wants. That employees would inject cogito in him soon. She also asks what river flows in him, and what world is held within him. There are as many worlds as there are people. Discovering them is quite fun, considering, well, that some abnormalities. This can include worlds outside this star system and even parallel Earths. I mean, just look at the birds that made up the apocalypse bird. That came from a crack in reality. Her eyes turned white at the pleasure of what was happening. None can see that. It's why they're adjusting the level of cogito to her order. Most of those within the extraction department being blind and deaf. People shouldn't make eye contact with the drawer, but she must gaze into their eyes until the end. She can't look away regardless of how painful it is. Eyes containing an unbeatable void, and things that shouldn't exist that only she can endure. That was the punishment A gave her. Most others would have gone mad thousands of times. She can't be granted the blessing of madness, only to lock herself into their eyes. I mean, has she encountered Die Freischutz? Because that sounds familiar. Now they wait. They need more time to see if it can be sent up to start anew, or to spread eternity in that pillar with her. As for what the pillars hold, A is lucky. Sometimes when cogito is inadequately adjusted, things that should not exist come up like fragments. She finds it funny saying this, but it's like an adverse reaction that comes at a price for doing the unspeakable to human beings. The bucket draws other things than what is needed, such as the abyss that sleeps beneath humanity, subconsciousness, and every possibility. The things from the past, present, even the future. Everything. They're out of control. They can't do anything about them. They float around, echoing with the abnormalities, and eventually manifest themselves once the time comes. They are called ordeals. Fortunately, they can be suppressed with firepower, or just being bludgeoned to death. But that's all they can do. Extracting the abnormalities, that's her work. But creating them was Carmen, whom A buried long ago. She's the mother of all abnormalities. At least those that didn't come from a dimensional tear like in the Black Forest. She asks the manager how he feels now that he knows that the abnormalities he's faced are part of those pillars. If he feels anything about that agonizing view. She considers running away from his memory and acting like nothing happened as his speciality. Well, by that point he hadn't done that, so why would he do that? Anyway, Bainar spoke of that place as one of silence, a no man's land. Employees who visit there usually lose their minds and embrace the oblivion. It's been a while since she has time to talk with someone. He's mistaken that she's the only one there, but she has countless companions spending eternity with her. She introduced him to one of them. He created the bucket by rebuilding, dividing, and proliferating Carmen's body. He also created cogito, the fluid of life and death. It was a small amount back then, but soon it infinitely grew, and is now stagnating like a pond. Carmen, or rather, what's left of her, is looking at them under that pond. Looking at any who would dare, like Bainar. She looks at the bottom of it when she finds that it's becoming too burdening. It feels like they're alone in the world when she does that. Surprising, considering. Sometimes it feels like she's talking to her, even though at this point she's only an amalgamation of flesh, brain, and nerve endings, floating beneath the pond. Some injected it. Some went mad upon seeing her. Some gave their body and became lifeless and deathless. Yeah, this is what Hokma meant about her core being removed. The others couldn't take all of this, told everything to the head. The collaboration of despair that A and Carmen made. Michelle being the one who informed the head, and why she, as Garion, came there. He's still not qualified to look down into the pond, as he needs to look straight to his road to do so. She then asked if he was seeking redemption, the manager rather, or is he seeking to redeem all who are trapped there with her? The manager might think that saving that facility from sin is all he has to do, himself included. One who hasn't got out of that facility for a long time. One who would know that there are people hopelessly being killed by abnormalities. I think by then, he is already well aware of that. As it's practically standard procedure for at least some employee to die, not necessarily agents. Although, who dies, it depends on the abnormalities chosen. Every wing has its own share of painful stories, along with the nest, the back streets, the ruins, outskirts, the unimaginable pain that is prevailing in that world. She has seen everything, because she wasn't being obsessed with unreachable ideals like A was. The world he looked up at, and the world she looked down on, was different. He captured her and tortured her to his heart's content. But they're still writhing in despair. Someone likely replaced her and became the arbiter of the head, and was swinging claws at him. Clearly they believed that Garion was dead. Technically true, but in reality she was worse than dead. Regardless, she sees it as pointless to break the cycle. broken wings will spread anew. A brief resistance will soon be forgotten, and people will live on. Just because they can't die. Well, considering how bad it is on the surface, she had a point. Not that the manager would listen to her anyway, seeing as he's got that far. Yeah, and also how much has been revealed and figured out by this point in the story. Don't worry, that's coming. I've just got one more lore topic to cover before we get to the history of the facility, and also the last department. A might think that she's drawn her down, but she's still looking down on him, twitching like bugs. She wants to see him suffer in pain after realizing that the cycle will never end. She wants to see him kneeling before the might of destiny, despair, to submit to his fate, resist to his very end and finally break, to let the final resistance melt and quietly flow through the water underneath the earth. Yeah. That'd be the case if he was still around. During her meltdown, similar to Gabura's, she becomes a suppressible entity. She'll spawn in the main room of her department. And it doesn't provide passive handicaps. As a consequence, she will act like an abnormality, with the name changed to an arbiter, and equal to the Red Mist in overall combat capability, but not identical. She has an immense amount of HP, and must be suppressed 3 times by depleting her HP bar to be defeated completely, and her behavior will change each time she is suppressed. An arbiter doesn't suffer damage made by abnormalities. Fairy and Key are 2 singularities that she uses, even though they are severely weakened, at least according to the Rabbit team. During Phase 1, she'll summon special Krivoff meltdowns, dark meltdowns and golden meltdowns. All departments possess Krivoff meltdown immunity against standard meltdowns given from the Krivoff meltdown gauge, even if the department isn't immune. She will appear from the main room of the extraction departments, and will roam through the facility with a yellow aura, trying to get into the upper departments. She's severely resistant to damage at the start. Yes, she can take a heavy amount of beating. She then spawns and summons the special meltdowns. She'll also raise dark spikes below the agents of the other departments, dealing a great amount of black damage to anyone standing on its position. Thankfully, this takes a short amount of time to trigger, so movement is a good thing to have when this happens. Upon seeing a target in the same room, she will perform an attack. She will take pauses between attacks before starting a new one. Glad to see she hasn't lost her touch. With her pillar attack, she will charge a pillar in front of her with a random damage type, which can be identified by her aura. She will then shoot it across the facility in a straight line, horizontally, dealing a massive amount of damage of that damage type, and any containment units in the way of the pillar will get a grip-off meltdown added. The slash attack will involve her charging an aura on her hand of a random damage type, and soon after, she will deal a wave of slashes in front of her, reaching the end of the room. The damage dealt upon passing next to... well, as a byproduct, any containment units that the slash attack passes will add a grip-off meltdown, with dark effects. As for the special grip-off meltdowns, these are summoned by the Arbiter. They are different from the standard variety, but work similar to them. And if the counter reaches 0, it will still add the penalty of a normal meltdown. She summons 6 dark meltdowns and 6 golden meltdowns, working and removing all of a particular kind of special meltdown will help to stop the Arbiter. How, you may ask? Well, the dark meltdown has a grey border around it, which will add a 10% success rate penalty to the abnormality. Upon removing all of them, a grey orb would be shot towards the Arbiter, and upon removing all of them in time, her defences will decrease by a good amount. She will receive double damage against all damage types for a while, before decreasing to 0.8 times. The golden meltdown creates a meltdown with a golden border around the containment units. Upon removing them, a golden orb will be shot towards the Arbiter, and upon removing all of them in time, the Arbiter will be stunned, unable to move and attack for a while, becoming open to attacks. After a while, the Arbiter will summon her special grip-off meltdowns again if she's not pushed into the next phase in time, even if all the meltdowns are removed. As usual, the spikes will be resummoned as well during the reassignment of the special meltdowns. Yes. Better take care of all of them then. When Phase 2 is reached, when suppressed once, the background music changes, and the Arbiter will summon special grip-off meltdowns again. Golden and dark meltdowns, along with another one, the Meltdown of Waves. Her attacks remain the same, with the same behavior. Her defense will return back to resistance, as in 0.1 times damage. And as usual when summoning the meltdowns, dark spikes will raise below the agent's position to try to damage them with black damage. The Meltdown of Waves creates 5 purple meltdowns that keep minor dark invulnerable creatures spawning across the facility. These beings act similar to the King of Greed or the Ordeals of Amber. Dawn and Dusk, to be more precise. Going straight forward and dealing a considerable amount of black damage to any employees in its path. They move slowly and cannot be damaged, often burrowing and appearing in other parts of the facility. By removing all of the Meltdown of Waves, the creatures will disappear. If the meltdowns aren't all removed, the Arbiter will summon more of them later. Yeah, best to clear away all of them, as they'd get in the way and, well, after being suppressed twice, Phase 3 begins. The screen filter changes to something similar to that of a snowstorm, dust particles, or a granulated screen effect. The Arbiter will stop in her current position and summon 7 Meltdown of Pillars and charge a special attack. Stopping time is disabled. During this phase, the Arbiter will become immune to damage and will charge up pillars around herself in the cardinal directions, up to 8 pillars of random damage types. These Meltdown of Pillars will be marked by cyan border around the containment units, around the facility. They have an additional penalty of 20% success rate. Removing them will cause the Arbiter to stop their attack, not using it, with defenses decreasing to 0.8 times normal, and then moving to another spot, repeating the special attack and adding the Meltdown of Pillars again. And if not all of the Meltdown of Pillars are removed in time, the Arbiter will shoot the pillars in the directions that they're facing, dealing massive damage of whatever type they're in to any entity in its way, and applying normal Kripoff meltdowns to any containment units in the way. And then the Arbiter will add more Meltdowns of Pillars, repeating. To finish this event, the manager must defeat the Arbiter, and then Biner will reward the manager with permanent upgrades. Ego equipment will no longer be lost when an employee dies, and the extraction team will not be affected by the Kripoff meltdown. When she became less psychotic than she was earlier, Biner says that only trembling dying things excite her. Only the sound of dying breath and the face that clings onto fading life satisfies her. She sees herself and the manager as the same, the mutants of that age, the ones that fit into that world. A planned everything, but whatever is done there, the world won't change. Rising wings, syndicates from backstreets, things from the outskirts, abyss from the ruins, arbiters like her, claw and eyes. He'll never stand a chance against them alone. But the world won't change just by standing there either. The only thing that they have in common is that they're both prisoners. The difference being that the manager is a prisoner by choice. Reminds me of a game with a Pomeranian as the avatar of one of the makers. Then the perception filter dropped, and she said that she would see everything he does. She would not avoid, she would not hide, she would not rest, she would never close her eyes or turn her head. She told him to just go ahead, as he's always been doing. Then he might make it. Right, before we go over the history and then the last department, there's just one more lore topic to go over. That will be next. Until next time, Hail the rabbit!